So, Mr. Friedman, currently a lot is said about the future of Russia in the long run, but also there are talks about that, you know, it's so unpredictable, so still it's better to have Putin. Still, it's better to have him rather than unknown players, and this is what the different security expert would advise the governments. What would you say on that?
I would say that personalities are not very important. If Putin were hit by a car tomorrow, Russia would still have a fundamental interest in Ukraine, and Russia would try to influence events there. We tend to focus on personalities, believing that a new prime minister would simply be able to change, a new president would simply be able to change policies. It's much more complicated than that. In opposing Russia, it is absolutely essential to understand that this is not a whim by Putin. This is not because he's power hungry. Ukraine was the place where the Russians destroyed Wehrmacht. Ukraine is the buffer for Russia. A neutral Ukraine is in the Russian interest. It is not a Ukrainian interest, it is not Western interest, but it is a Russian interest. And it really doesn't have to do with who the president is. Whoever it is will have a deep interest in influencing Ukraine.
How could we know what really happens in the Kremlin? Because, you know, everybody says there is so much opportunities these days to, you know, with all this satellite, all this technical equipment we have these days to really know more, but there is very little information which is coming from. There are no anyone leaked, more or less, talk and anything like that.
Because you don't look at what they say. Because even if you heard what they say, one of the things we learned in the collapse of the Soviet Union was that there's a Politburo who knew the last that it was going to collapse. It was in the case of what they do, that is what really matters. So what have we seen the Russians do? They had a relatively pro-Russian government in place in Kiev. They failed to protect it. They failed to understand what was happening in Maidan. They held on to Crimea, but it was holding on. It was not an invasion. It was something they had. And they tried to create an uprising in the east. And really they failed. Even in the eastern areas which they've taken, they never overwhelmed Ukrainian forces. They were put to a standstill. So when we look at the Russians, they're much weaker than we invent. We tend to think of them as much more powerful. And it's very interesting what they didn't do. They didn't send large-scale forces into the Ukraine. They didn't send multiple divisions moving westward. They accepted the battle line in which they were fighting and let it go. So I think the problem that Putin has is not what is he going to do. It's what can he do? And the real issue for Ukraine is that the thing that he hopes for the most is instability in Kiev. The great opportunity of the Russians of reversing the course that Ukraine is on is if Kiev cannot govern Ukraine, if Kiev has internal crises, this the FSB can take advantage of. This they can manipulate. So what is clear after a year is, one, the Russian economy is in trouble. Two, the various things they tried did not succeed in strategically changing the situation. Ukraine is moving further into the Western hands. And finally, that a unified Ukraine, in the end, is going to be the best defense.
And how successful is the Western response? Because there are many of those who really criticize that, you know, the Western countries and the NATO hadn't been prepared at all.
Well, we begin by saying that the Ukrainians certainly had failed to prepare themselves. The problem of this region is the expectation that someone else will provide their national security. And it's very difficult to provide national security, as we learned in Iraq, from countries that aren't prepared to defend themselves. Now Ukraine has changed its status. It is prepared to. It's possible to provide security. But in providing security, you must understand what the threat is. And I'm certainly not pro-Russian, and I was talking about the likelihood of conflict in Ukraine long before others were. But it's also necessary to understand in proportion what the Russians are capable of, what's not. The maps you refer to was an examination of, is the Russian military in a position to occupy such an enormous country, even against no resistance, but certainly against resistance if the American Air Force would intervene against the tanks.
And all these breaking the airspace of the NATO countries in the Scandinavian countries, and also the waters and all these murky things with capturing the Estonian officer, but how secure is the countries which are in NATO?
The purpose of these is for newspapers to get excited. Entering another country's airspace is not strategically significant. They go in, they go out. What are they going to do? The capture of the officer is complex. It's difficult to understand. Entering waters. The United States enters Russian airspace regularly. This is designed so that reporters, have something to discuss.
And there is a lot of buzz about this hybrid warfare, though some people would say there is nothing new. The KGB had acted this way before, targeting some other countries' vulnerabilities or some particular groups of vulnerabilities. But what is new for there? What are things which could be learned from this particular conflict, from Russian aggression, and what could be done with that?
The first thing to recognize is how poorly the FSB performed in Ukraine. The events at Maidan were supported by American, German, and other funds. The FSB should have been in a position to understand where this was leading. They failed. They failed to control the events. Similarly, they intervened in the East with the expectation of the pro-Russian population rising. The FSB failed to generate the rising. They failed to understand that it wouldn't. From my point of view, the FSB is a significant intelligence organization that has, certainly not what it was 20 years ago. It is complex, it is tied up with financial transactions and so on. It is not as good as it once was. And when we look at the Russians, from an American point of view, I look at them and they bumbled. They took a fundamental national interest, a neutral Ukraine. And rather than maintain that, they have small fragments here and there. And that doesn't mean that it's over. It does mean that the Russians are busy reevaluating their failures. And they're very busy trying to compensate for it. But they're also waiting for a crisis in Kiev generated by the Ukrainians themselves. The Ukrainians have a tendency to have political crises that can be exploited. So far it hasn't happened.
How do you see these, not already talk, there was this vote in Senate about providing Ukraine with lethal aid. How serious is that, and would it be the game changer in some way?
It's very serious. It's not a game changer. The amount, if you look at the size of Ukraine, the forces, the equipment, the Air Force, and everything else that we require to provide full security is something that it'll take many years for the Ukrainians to be in a position to provide. The idea that the Poles, the Americans, the Germans are going to come into Ukraine, particularly the Germans aren't going to do this. The Russian view is that it must be neutralized. The American view is that it can't be neutralized, but on the other hand, it can't be fully defended. So the American focus, if you notice, is on Poland, the Baltics, Romania. This is the line of defense we have. And Ukraine is the country on the edge again, in a difficult position between the two.
Sure, but what could be also the trades-off for Russia, for the United States, if you speak globally? Because there is the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but there are other things in Syria, Iran, and all other things. So is it discussed? What are the things discussed?
Oh, well, I'm sure they discuss many things and they'll come to an end. You have to remember that for the United States, for 100 years we've had a fixed foreign policy. That there should be no hegemon dominating Europe and Asia. We fought against the Germans twice. We fought the Cold War against the Soviets over this question. We are, again, automatically responding to it. But the Americans never come in early, and when they come in big, which means there has to be an ally that is able to guarantee its own national security to some extent. The invasion of France was not something we enjoyed. So it's a very complex situation, but I think the most important thing to notice, which of course is difficult when you're close to the situation, is how badly the Russians did. So if you take a look at what the Russians wanted to achieve in the Ukraine, to maintain a neutral Ukraine, a pro-Russian Ukraine, and how they bungled it completely, you understand that you